Good afternoon. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Very nice lunch, and thank you very much for organising this very timely conference today. My focus is very much on the EU itself as an actor in international relations, because that's where I'm coming from, IR, and the EU, of course, has always been a problem for IR scholars because we like to think of states as actors, rightly or wrongly. And the EU was always sort of poised somewhere between a sort of incompetent federal state and an overdeveloped international organisation. So it was a problem in conceptualising exactly what it was, and so I was concerned a few years ago with thinking about how the EU was an actor and whether it was an actor. And in relation to this talk, I'm using, when I was doing that, I set up, or we set up, because I did this with Charlotte Bretherton, various criteria that you could use to establish whether or not it was an actor. But we also looked at the conditions under which the EU emerged as an actor, which were capability, presence, and opportunity. And I'm going to use those categories because I think you can use them as well to look at the extent to which the EU has been an effective negotiator, an effective actor. And I'm doing this in particular in the context of the Framework Convention, the climate regime, narrowly construed. And the main thesis that I'm going to advance is that the EU has indeed shaped the characteristics of the UN Framework Convention. And insofar as any progress has been made, and that of course is a moot point with this convention over the 20 years of its existence, the EU must take a substantial amount of credit. There were reasons, I think, to suggest that this could not continue, that the EU was not going to be able to do the things that it had done in the past, and people said that this was graphically demonstrated by the events of the Copenhagen COP in 2009, which was, of course, a huge disappointment. It's also important to note that in many ways the EU tied its legitimacy as an international actor to its climate leadership. So climate leadership played a number of had a number of other important functions for the EU. However, it is also the case, as we've heard this morning, that by 2011, certainly by the Durban Conference of the Parties last year, some sort of leadership appears to have been partially restored. And I want to look at these two, to go through this in a bit more detail, and to think about the conditions under which the EU can be or cannot be an effective negotiator. A couple of general points to start with. I always like this because it kind of demonstrates the complexity of the climate regime. And of course the climate regime goes well beyond the focus of my remarks. The climate regime comprises not only the conference of the parties, the meetings of the parties which go on parallel at the same time, but a vast international and growing international architecture of intersessional meetings, ad hoc working groups, plus many other forums in which climate discussions are held internationally, the Major Economies Forum, G20, Cartagena Dialogue, and now even the ICAO and other bodies. So it's a huge, sprawling undertaking across the international system. The second thing I would like to point out, which is pretty obvious, but I think deserves mention, is the extremely close connection between external and internal policy in this area. Notwithstanding the remarks that I made earlier, I was trying to be a bit provocative this morning about, symbolic leadership and so on, and credibility. It is the case that the two have been linked together in the sense, and in a sense it makes it rather different from other areas of EU external policy. If you think of the EU's other external foreign policy activities, there are not very many of them where there is this very tight connection between internal and external policy. And that connection works both to stimulate internal policy, which I think was the case after the Kyoto Protocol, but also as we've also seen, it provides, internal policy provides what is seen as the necessary credibility for EU external action. Right, the thesis is that, and I think it's fairly uncontroversial, that certainly over the first 15 years or so, the EU definitely has shaped the UNFCCC. There's a pretty clear record on targets and timetables, on emissions trading, although slightly paradoxical, of course, that the flexibility mechanisms in Kyoto were something that the EU originally opposed, but took on board when the United States demanded them and then ran with and made its own after 2001. And the EU has actively tried to shape a post-2012 system that would be, if we summarise the EU's objectives, that would have a binding and comprehensive agreement that would involve somehow the United States, although that was a very, very tall order, that would arrange appropriate participation of the major economies of the South, which of course everybody knew from about, well, everybody had known for some years, were going to be responsible for the major part of future greenhouse gas emissions, even if they were not responsible for historic emissions. So the other task was somehow, alongside bringing in the United States, it was to try and involve the major economies of the fast developing economies of the South. And finally, the other objective was to support the rest of the developing world in mitigation and adaptation. So there was a historic record of shaping what came out, what developed in Kyoto, clearly, post-Kyoto, but also ambitions for post-2012. Now, as we've seen, Copenhagen regarded as a serious failure. The Union, of course, had laboured mightily to create a post-2012 position with the climate and energy package. And it had made the famous offer, 20% increase to 30% reductions if other major players were willing to come on board, a contingent offer. And alongside that, again, subject to very difficult negotiations at the last minute before Copenhagen, was a funding package for fast start funding for climate change. All this was put in place with a great deal of difficulty prior to Copenhagen. Copenhagen was very much talked up at the time, as I think we all remember, as a critical turning point in which a comprehensive agreement might be achieved. Looking back, as I think it was somewhat optimistic to suggest that might be the case. And everything appeared to go seriously wrong. The basics had emerged and cut a deal with the United States at the last moment, a non-binding accord. The question of whether the EU was in the room or not is a moot one. I mean, I wrote at the time that the EU was excluded from the negotiations. I got a very hot response from somebody who'd been at Copenhagen, the UK delegation, that was not the case, that the EU was fully involved and so on and so forth. But most commentators would say the EU was excluded. I think it was particularly unfortunate because not only was the EU excluded, not only did its ploy of putting a position on the table and hoping others would respond, and its ploy also of attempting to have the lure of climate funding, not only did that seem to be ignored, but also some of the member states, and I think one includes Gordon Brown in this, have been complicit in talking up the whole thing. So you had a high-level segment that involved heads of government, which was relatively unusual. And I think that was a major problem, because once you start involving Obama and heads of government, you have to come away with something. Something must be achieved. And that's very much the background, I think, of the Copenhagen Accord. And the outcome of Copenhagen, alongside the Accord, was a set of Annex 1 pledges, which are very variegated. This appeared at the time to be a triumph of a bottom-up approach, which would put it in somewhere in the left-hand quadrant of Andy's diagram this morning. whereby participating nations were simply asked, I think, 2 months to put in 2 months after Copenhagen, a set of the pledges that they were prepared to make. Seemed to be a return to pledge and review. Pledge and review had been a rather flawed idea that had been put forward prior to Kyoto. This is the way in which the climate change convention might develop. Simply that nations would put on the table what they could offer in terms of emissions reductions, and the other people would meet together, and review them and talk about their adequacy and so on and so forth. There were also a set of voluntary pledges of a different type put forward by non-Annex I countries, and there they are, with China offering a cut in carbon intensity by 40 to 45%, India rather reluctantly following suit, etc., etc. These are voluntary pledges. Another a critical EU failure, which I think deserves to be talked about, was not only failing to get others to respond to the upfront EU position on 20 and 30%, but also prior to Copenhagen, at an intersessional meeting in Bangkok, I believe, dropping its commitment to a second round of Kyoto 2. That was dropped prior to Copenhagen. And this, in retrospect, may be seen as something of quite a major mistake and quite a major reversal, given the total commitment to Kyoto and to emissions trading, international emissions trading, that had been evident in 2005. I remember going to meetings in 2005 in Brussels, at which they had invited somebody from the American embassy, and the way he was treated in terms of the American attitude towards emissions trading and towards Kyoto was something to behold. And I felt in the room at the time that the commitment to Kyoto was almost akin to religious devotion in Brussels. This was the thing, targets and timetables in Kyoto. And suddenly this is dropped prior to Copenhagen, because really the EU's strategy, I think, was at the time to say, well, the Americans aren't going to buy this, so we must concentrate in another way to bring in the United States and the Obama administration and China and India. Problem, of course, was that for China and India and for other members of the G77, which of course is a badly split group in terms of climate change, their bottom line was the continuance of the Kyoto Protocol. The strategy began to change towards Cancun. And by the time you get to Cancun, things look a little better, in the sense that the EU has managed to achieve one or two things. It's managed to go back to talking about a new round of the Kyoto Agreement. It's got at least the Copenhagen Accord codified, turned into something which has more status internationally than a simple accord. It becomes an agreement under Cancun, and a future work program. So there's a shift in Cancun. Running up to Durban, which is now regarded as something as much more of a success, the EU has a set of aims. Kyoto 2 is possible, even though most of the original members of Kyoto have now dropped out. The EU is willing to go on with it, but that is going to be made contingent upon a new roadmap for an ambitious, legally binding, comprehensive agreement by all the major economies by 2020. I mean, essentially what this does is to link the two tracks of the negotiation that have been going on since Bali, that is the Kyoto track and the long-term LCA track, which the Americans would buy into, will not be concerned with Kyoto, to link the two and to say to the developing world, okay, we will have a Kyoto 2, but the price of that is agreement to a long-term roadmap. And that essentially was achieved in Durban, in the Durban platform, as it's known. which will succeed the long-term cooperative, the LCA track, and hopefully will come up with a legally, what is the phrase, an agreed outcome with legal force. These things are important actually in negotiations, not a protocol, not an agreement or an amendment necessarily to the convention, but an agreed outcome with legal force. And that was a sticking point right at the end of the Durban negotiations, because many parties would not have reference to a strictly binding comprehensive legal agreement. The hope that this will be negotiated by 2015 and will come into force in 2020. Obviously the level of ambition here is inadequate. It pushes actual commitments, the actual implementation of commitments beyond 2020. But what it does do, I think, and this is a success, is it breaks down the firewall that has existed prior to this in the negotiations between the Annex 1 and the rest. That is to say, there is now a recognition by major developing economies that they have to make commitments as well. And that is something new, because prior to that they have tended to shelter behind the common responsibilities, differentiated commitments, differentiated responsibilities, CBDR thing, and respective capabilities. They've sheltered behind that, which comes from the very early days of the convention. And now that has been eroded. So you can see that as something, this is something of an achievement for the EU. So when the European Council on Foreign Relations actually scores this, it gives the, and this is quite remarkable actually, because these are quite high scores in terms of the EU's overseas activities. It scores Cancun at B+, an amazing, it scores Cancun at B+, and amazingly gives Durban an A- score in relation to all the other EU's external activities. This may tell you something about the rest of what the EU does, but never mind. So here we have the EU making early commitments, drafting the script for Durban, offering to revive Kyoto if the roadmap is accepted. And in doing this, it makes some fairly critical alliances, particularly with the alliance of small island states and the less developed countries. And it does a compromise with India and the United States on a final text. As I say, it's very doubtful as to what this actually all may mean, and we may find out rather more in a month's time at what it actually means. So this is the background. This gives you a sense in which the EU managed to recover its position from Copenhagen. I now want to try and look at the EU's role, and in doing so I want to have a stab at a sort of underlying explanation about the determinants of the EU's effectiveness as a climate negotiator, as a climate change negotiation actor. And I'm going to do it briefly in terms of the categories we use to think about the EU as the conditions under which the EU could emerge as an actor distinct from its member states. And the three that we used were capabilities, presence and opportunity. And I think you can link these, as I have done elsewhere, to the leadership categories that we talked about. And I'm going to try and do so briefly: structural, entrepreneurial and cognitive leadership. I think the things are related. If I can start with capabilities and competence. It really is quite a paradox that climate policy is an area in which the Union does not have a great deal of competence. In fact, competence is shared, but it is an area where the Union has, I suppose, as we, in comparison with its other activities, been historically quite effective. And I think it has been. I've tried to demonstrate that the Union has been historically effective in shaping the characteristics of the climate regime. Competence remains a difficulty. In fact, it has been argued, I think, that given the changes in the Lisbon Treaty, it would be possible for the Commission to go to the ECJ and get its competence established on the basis of the kind of internal legislation that has been done on climate, and to establish EU competence for climate change negotiations. And many people saw a row that occurred immediately after the Lisbon Treaty over competence at the negotiations, would you believe, for mercury, for UNEP negotiations over mercury, as a test run for a competence battle over climate change. In fact, I think the Commission has backed off that, so we are still in the position of shared competence. And I think Rudy did pretty well this morning in outlining the complexities of the way in which EU policy is made in this area under the conditions of shared competence and the working group and so on and so forth, and the different ways it's done in terms of the Troika and the lead actors and so on and so forth. So I won't dwell on this. The only thing I will say, of course, is that in climate change terms, the EU as an actor enjoys the position of an REIO, a Regional Economic Integration Organisation, of which, by the way, the EU is the only extant example, but which is a neat formula that allows the EU and its member states all to participate and to sign international environmental agreements. This started some time ago, I think, with the Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution Agreement, but it's been carried over into things like the CBD and now the Climate Change Convention. So it enables, in fact, the EU to negotiate now at 28, soon to be at 29. That is to say, there's the Commission plus all the member states with all the problems of coordination. Enlargement, of course, has been a problem. It increases the difficulties of coordination. It brings to the table countries, as we've seen this morning, that may have a problem with CO2 emissions. And there's also, I mean, you can say, I mean, I have heard it argued that coordination, although it may waste a lot of time, is actually in some ways a good thing, although it frustrates all the other interlocutors of the EU in the negotiation, is in fact a good thing because it enables the issues to be thrashed out very thoroughly to start with. I don't know whether you buy that or not, but it's definitely a problem. The other thing, of course, is the old chestnut of who speaks for Europe. I particularly like this picture. This is Obama meets the EU at Copenhagen. Now, if you go around the table, all these people have to be present. There's Barroso, who said afterwards, I heard him say afterwards, the problem with Copenhagen was there were too many leaders, quote, unquote. And there you have it. You have the Swedish presidency, but Merkel has to be there, of course, there's the Swedish presidency. The French have to be there, and Gordon Brown is there as well. So it's very, very complicated. I'm not sure who the woman is. She may be. I'm not sure. I have not. Can anybody identify the woman? Next to Sarkozy, we can make. I don't know. She's probably translating for him. I don't know. Or got the wrong room. Yeah. No, I'm not sure of that. Not sure of that. But that's a continuing problem where there isn't full union competence. But as I say, for me, the paradox is that despite all of this, and despite the fact that you had the Polish presidency of all things at Durban, the EU seems to have been relatively effective in not declining to the lowest common denominator in its negotiations. The other thing that comes along with capabilities is instruments. Now, obviously, as all the literature says, the EU is a civil power. It does not have the kind of military instruments that one normally encounters, although it's got some developing crisis capability in the common security and defence policy. But of course, these are pretty much irrelevant when it comes to environmental or climate negotiations. It does have a number of quite important assets which bear upon its capabilities for leadership, in terms of being a policy entrepreneur and having expertise and cognitive assets, if you like. In terms of sticks, it's got trade instruments if it wants to use them. It's got the carrot of single market access, and it's got a potentially fairly large diplomatic set of assets. The problem is pulling all these together in a coherent way. There was one moment, I think, in the climate story of the EU's external relations when it did so, and that was over the ratification of Kyoto. This was seen as sufficiently important to mobilise embassies right across the system and to put a certain amount of pressure on the Russians and use some elements and use some of those levers in terms of Russian acts, support for Russian accession to the WTO and some issues on gas pricing, actually to bring the Russians on board. So it was, you can use these assets. There are examples of using these assets, but it's usually not the case that they are properly coordinated. And one of the things one can say about the EEAS, the new External Action Service, one of the interesting things will be how far it can move towards this, towards being getting the EU to be a more coherent actor where it does use its strengths. The problem, of course, in terms of it's actually used finance quite effectively in the past. The problem now, as I think came up this morning, was that it's very problematic under current budgetary conditions that this will be as easy as it has been in the past. The other aspect that I think I would run in any analysis is that of presence. And presence simply means the underlying position, the kind of weight the EU has in the international system, the kind of influence it has simply by being there, not doing anything, the kind of attraction it can exert. In the past, this has been very important in the development of EU activeness, the size of its economy, the attractions of the single market. When one comes to look at its key aspects of its presence in terms of climate change, I suppose one has to look at its global share of CO2 emissions, the extent to which the EU can be part of the solution. What is really notable about all this is that there are really 6 big actors responsible, that are responsible for CO2 emissions, that account for 71% of the emissions. China obviously is at the top, and I'm talking now about current, not historic emissions, the US after that, and the EU is an interesting case because when we started with the climate change regime, the EU was accounted for about 20% of global CO2 emissions. In 2006 it was 13%, and now we are down to 11%. So the presence of the EU in the system in terms of emissions is reduced, and this may have implications for its negotiating effectiveness. Although one can also run alongside that some of the numbers we saw this morning. The other thing one can say about EU emissions is that they have very much been decoupled from economic growth. So that's something that might be favourable about that. The third category that I think determines how effective the EU will be is what we have called the opportunity structure. And one of the things that always strikes me about studies by my colleagues in international environmental politics is that they very often tend to look at a particular negotiation in isolation. They treat it as a sort of closed box, and they study the internal dynamics of the bargaining and so on and so forth. But of course that is, that rather misrepresents a situation in which the EU and its activities in the Climate Change Convention are very much embedded in a wider international structure. Here one can see that the opportunity structure, if you like, for the EU was very, very favourable at the point at which it was attempting to exert leadership in the Climate Change Convention. End of the Cold War, people turning to Europe to look to deal with Eastern Europe and so on and so forth. And above all, US abdication from climate leadership. The EU was able to step into the breach and build a position upon that. And notably, of course, in 2001, when the Bush administration denounced its signature of the Kyoto Protocol. But even before then, EU environmental leadership across a number of areas has been in serious decline. The high watermark, I suppose, would be the Montreal Protocol back in the late 1980s. But from then onwards, the United States is increasingly uninterested, and the EU is able to exploit that. But of course, fairly soon after that point, you get another big structural change occurring, which is the rise of the basic economies in climate change. The importance of the basics, which is absolutely clear by 2009, and the way in which the basics do the deal on the Copenhagen Accord with the United States. The abandonment of Kyoto is also a key factor. Yeah, I can do it in that. The abandonment of Kyoto is also a key factor because the other members, by the time you get through to Copenhagen, it's clear that the Japanese, the Russians, Canadians are out of Kyoto. There is one factor that has become important in terms of the structure that I would argue the EU has exploited rather satisfactorily in getting a deal at Durban and before that at Cancun. That is what is known as the Cartagena Dialogue. The EU has historically, in these negotiations, tried to occupy the middle ground, tried to act as a bridge between the G77 and the AOSIS and less developed countries, and the United States and the Umbrella Group. It's done that in other negotiations as well. It sees itself as having this rather pivotal role based upon its progressive view environmentally and in terms of climate policy, but also on what it sees as its special role in North-South politics, its commitment to development politics with the ACP and so on and so forth, and the kind of links that it has. So that's a role it's like to play. And in fact, what happened, I think, prior to Cancun and Durban was a reassessment in terms of the use of getting into that position again. And critical to that was an agreement to carry on with Kyoto, having dropped a commitment to Kyoto prior to Copenhagen. The Cartagena Dialogue is quite important in all of this. It was dreamt up at Copenhagen, apparently by some British and Australian diplomats who thought this might be a good idea. And they basically canvassed a group of what is now 40-odd countries who were interested in progressing in a more progressive approach to the climate regime. And this has met, this informal space, as it is known, it's not really a proper alliance or anything like that, it's an informal space, has met on occasions before the COPs and has recently met before the upcoming COP at Doha. And the interesting and the good thing about it is, in a sense, if you see it covers all the bases. You've got umbrella group members, you've got less developed country members, you've got South Africa for the basics, you've got some small island states, you've even got an OPEC member. So this is a very useful way of developing a position for in the climate change COP. And I think that has been developed, it certainly was developed before Durban, and it will have provided a way of for the EU to develop its position prior to Doha. Three things in conclusion. Have I got a minute? We don't know what's going to emerge from Doha. I suppose we can discuss it if we have some time. There is a danger that it will simply be symbolism. I've talked about the way in which EU leadership has revived, but I wonder how significant this will be actually in climate change terms, whether this will be just yet another exercise, if you like, in kicking the can down the road past 2020 and so on and so forth. Two, the euro crisis dominates everything. And there are subsidiary problems of internal disunity. And there is a sense in which, as I think Andy said, you know, it's an existential crisis for the EU itself. So everything else is contingent upon what happens with the economic crisis of the Union and whether the Union holds together. And finally, and surprisingly we haven't talked about this, but I think we shall have to in the future, there is, if you read the International Energy Agency report that came out last week, there is a revolution going on in the supply of energy, in the generation and supply of energy, in relation to shale gas and new oil resources. It puts an end to the notion of peak oil, and it can change the entire international landscape in relation to climate change in ways that we can hardly envisage. And that, of course, is going to cast a shadow across the future of the climate change regime and what the EU does in it. I'm out of time.